Welcome back to episode 15 of the Rugby History Project. I'm your host Hattie, and today we're looking at a very brief history of the Women's Six Nations. Founded in 1996 as the Women's Home Nations Championship, the tournament has grown significantly over the last 30 years. This is the tale of the 7 nations that have made up the Six Nations. From the advent of international women's rugby in the 1980s, regular game time at the international level was a struggle. Only 132 test matches took place between 1982 and 1996, with 48 of those matches being Rugby World Cup games. European competitions held by FIRA were inconsistent, having only been held twice since their inception in 1988. Between 1992 and 1994, each of the home nations of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales set up their own Women's Rugby Union, leading to the end of the joint Women's Rugby Football Union. Despite the dissolution of a joint governing body, the 4 nations continued to work closely, forming the annual Women's Home Nations contest in 1996.
I played for England for 14 seasons and it was getting frustrating towards the sort of 9th, 10th, 11th year of my career, because that was the time, certainly around about the 1996 sort of time. I was England captain at the time, and I used to get frustrated by lack of recognition. I did feel that season was a big breakthrough.
Jill Burns, England captain, 2016. The inaugural Women's Home Nations Championship brought a level of respectability to the women's game which had not been seen before, despite 2 World Cups having been held in the UK. 1995 had seen particular lows for the world champions England, as they played just 1 match and their male counterparts declined to attend a dinner in honour of their World Cup win. Wales and Scotland were also lacking game time, whilst Ireland had only managed to play 8 games in total. However, with the inception of the home nations, the women's unions faced an influx of support. The Welsh Women's Rugby Football Union were given a £20,000 investment from J&J Motors of Llanelli to be used for the development of Women's Rugby Pathway in Wales, just a week before their clash against Scotland. Whilst England dominated on the pitch, Welsh newspaper coverage of the competition was second to none. Scotland and Ireland were not granted the same recognition, but nonetheless the 3 Celtic nations managed to all finish joint second with 1 game won each. England managed to win the contest with a Triple Crown and uniquely a Grand Slam. Unlike in the men's contest, in which a Grand Slam was not added until regular matches against France commenced in 1908, the Grand Slam has been in contention since the inception of the women's competition. The 1998 contest was the last Women's Home Nations. It was also the first in which England was not crowned the winners, and the only time in which Scotland would top the table. Despite bizarre press coverage, which often referred to the contest as the 5 nations rather than the home nations, and facing what was reported as Scotland's first sending off in international rugby, the Scots managed to nil Ireland, put 10 on Wales, and just squeak past England to win the title. They also demolished France at Rayburn Place in February, which perhaps led to the confusion of contemporary newspapers. The following few years would prove to be a period of great upheaval for the championship. In 1999, France officially entered for the first time, beating all teams bar England for a second-place finish. In 2000, Ireland became the first and so far only country to willingly leave the contest without any outside influence. Having struggled to make any real improvements and recording 3 straight wooden spoons, the Irish Women's Rugby Football Union made the tough decision to exit the competition after 1999 to focus on developing their domestic leagues. In a time when payers paid for the privilege to represent their nation and England-based players dominated the Irish side, it made sense to take a step back. In their place, it was decided that the next highest-ranked European side would take their place, Spain. Whilst Italy entered the men's version of the competition in the same year, and Italy's women's side was fairly well developed, Las Leonas had been a dominant force in European rugby during the 1990s. Unfortunately for Spain, they managed to win just 10 games during their 7-year tenure and were proud owners of 2 wooden spoons. Ireland rejoined the contest in 2002 to create the Six Nations, leading to a relatively calm 5-year period in which England, Ireland, France, Scotland, Spain and Wales battled for the title, although only France and England would be victorious. The 2006 edition was the last independent Women's Six Nations. Since its inception in 1996, the competition had been run by the women's rugby unions, with no input from the Men's Six Nations competition organisers. However, with many of the women's unions merging with their national unions, it was decided that the women's contest would come under the same organising powers as both the senior men's and under-20 men's competitions. This change of organising body led to a decision which still proves to be controversial in many women's rugby spheres, as Spain were replaced by Italy. The official reason given was for the contests to mirror each other. However, with the women's side experiencing significantly worse playing conditions, no pay and very little media exposure, mirrored competitions felt shallow and disingenuous. The one benefit of coming under the wider Six Nations umbrella was the introduction of a Six Nations trophy, an expense which had not previously been possible. Handed out for the first time in 2008, the original Thomas Light trophy was rather basic. Made of sterling silver and featuring the emblems of the 6 competing countries, the original trophy was in use until 2023. The slow growth of the Women's Six Nations during the 2010s is exceptionally unfortunate and had many causes. Despite hopeful moments, there was still a general apathy towards women's sport, which caused poor investment and poor marketing of the contest. Television coverage of the Women's Six Nations had always been sporadic. However, in 2011, England vs Scotland was shown live on the BBC, with England vs France being shown behind a paywall on Sky and France vs Scotland on France's Orange TV. By 2014, all teams bar Wales were broadcasting or streaming at least one of their games, and by 2016, all games were broadcast or streamed in some capacity. The coverage was still sporadic, with various levels of broadcast quality and the availability of games in certain locations questionable. Games often clashed with the Men's Six Nations fixtures as well as other Women's Six Nations fixtures, and were hidden away on streaming platforms. Anecdotally, it was not uncommon for Wales games to be advertised as being shown live on S4C, but in reality they were being live streamed on the S4C YouTube channel. Improvements were seen in 2021 as the BBC bought the rights to the Women's Six Nations in the UK. However, many non-England games continue to be hidden away on iPlayer. 2025 saw the Italian games shown on free-to-air TV Rai for the first time, with the broadcaster sub-licensing the rights from Sky. Whilst the 2010s saw stuttering growth off the pitch, Ireland saw huge on-pitch growth between 2012 and 2015, becoming the 4th nation to win the competition, achieving a Grand Slam in 2013 and lifting the trophy again in 2015 despite a narrow loss to reigning Grand Slam champions France. Whilst the golden era of Irish rugby did not last, it has provided us with a great insight into the reality of international amateur rugby in the 21st century. The 2020 and 2021 seasons would go on to change the Women's Six Nations and women's rugby forever, finally giving the competition the conditions in which to thrive, albeit accidentally. The 2020 contest was somewhat of a damp squib from the get-go. Whilst the first weekend went off without a hitch, weekend 2 was plagued by bad weather. Ireland's home game against Wales had to be paused to wait for hail and heavy rain to ease off, while Scotland's eventual home loss to England was moved behind closed doors to the following Monday due to the same inclement weather. Incidentally, that game would become the first Scottish women's headlining game at Murrayfield. Week 3 saw the first COVID-affected games, as Scotland were forced to travel home from Italy without having played the game. Week 4 saw 2 postponements, and Week 5 was postponed entirely as the world shut down. Whilst the tournament would be resumed in the autumn and England would be given the Grand Slam for winning 5 games, Scotland's games against Wales and Italy would never be played, whilst France and Ireland also did not face each other that year. The 2021 edition of the Women's Six Nations was played in a condensed format in April of that year. Required to take place due to the World Cup planned for later that year, and the Six Nations was played in the pool-style format that many journalists had spent years calling for. Due to the domination of England for most of the competition, English journalists had frequently called for a tiered or pool stage-style contest with a final game. When this took place in 2021, it proved to be exceptionally unpopular amongst fans and even organisers. However, the 2021 Six Nations did prove to be one of the most successful in terms of viewing figures, which were broadcast in its entirety on the BBC for the first time. With the contest being held in its own window away from the men's competition and an increased appetite for televised and women's sport during lockdown measures, the contest was a success. One of the major difficulties in rescheduling the 2020 competition and organising the 2021 edition entirely during the global pandemic was the fact that the women's game was still predominantly amateur. Whilst England and France had professionalised their programmes with the introduction of Rugby Sevens to the Olympics, as well as the development of domestic leagues, all countries have players with non-rugby playing jobs. For many countries, they have medical professionals within their squad who were needed in their home nations during the pandemic. Beyond that, it was impossible to properly bubble teams for long periods of time due to the fact that players had outside jobs. Beginning with Wales in 2022, the other 4 nations began to offer central contracts for players. However, in 2026, there are still amateur and semi-professional players representing their nations in the Women's Six Nations. Since 2022, the Women's Six Nations has seen rapid growth. arguably leading the way in terms of record attendances and professionalism. We also saw an updated trophy in 2024 and a modern rebranding. 2026 will see a record number of games in national stadia, as well as the first Rivalry Cup with the Solidarity Trophy between Ireland and France. There is still room for growth, with equitable broadcast quality between nations still needed and unions understanding the needs of both their players and fans. Despite the development that is still needed, the 2026 Six Nations is a far cry from 2020, where players were forced to shower in cold water, or 2015, where grassroots clubs have forgotten to keep the floodlights on. The Women's Six Nations is one of my favourite things to yap about, so I do hope you enjoyed this. This is just a very brief overview as a part of a wider series I'm working on about the Women's Six Nations. If you'd like a closer look at Spain or Ireland, you can find them on the site or on my YouTube, etc, etc. I've also collated a Six Nations results spreadsheet and a spreadsheet of the 2026 squad lists if you are so inclined. I will say they are not perfect, may have some mistakes, as I've yet to triple check them. But based on feedback from Women's Rugby Treehouse listeners, it's what the people want. You can find those links on my site. If you'd like more regular updates, please check out my Instagram, Twitter and/or Blue Sky. I've also recently started a Facebook page. I'm not really sure why, but it seemed like a good idea at like 2 a.m. when I did it, if that's more your vibe. You can also catch me podding every Tuesday morning with Rap or with Women's Rugby Treehouse somewhat regularly-ish. A written version of this episode is also available on my website, therugbyhistoryproject.com, which is also where you can check out my references and footnotes and blah blah blah. You can also upgrade to Historian tier to support the project.